What's up everybody? Welcome to Rex Engine. In this video I'm going to show you how to set up projectile attacks in Rex Engine. So to start with, I've got this empty scene, or mostly empty, and I've got the player character here. And I'm actually just going to get rid of his existing projectile attack so I can show you how to make one from scratch. So if we click on the player game object and go to Tools, Rex Engine, Add Attack, Add Projectile Attack, we can see that's created a new projectile attack as a child of the attacks object. And so if we hit play and test this, it should just be like a generic yellow pellet shot. And so there are tons and tons of properties we can play with here to give these projectiles a different feel. So if we want to make this feel more like the fireball from Mario, or the axe or the boomerang from Castlevania, or the charge shot from Mega Man, there's tons and tons of options. And so I just want to walk you through a few of those and get your imaginations running and show you guys some of what's possible with this system. So the first thing I want to show you guys is how to make it so you can aim a projectile if you press the D-pad in a direction. So on Projectile Attack, in the inspector, there's this projectile subheading here. And if you open that, it has a little checkbox here called Is Aimable, which does about what you'd expect. And so I'm going to check that, but there's one other thing that we need to do to make this work. And so in the projectile subheading, there's an option here called Rex Pool. And if we click on that, we can see it's a child of Projectile Attack. And it's this object called Rex Spawn Pool. And what that is basically is the spawn pool where the actual projectile itself resides. So there's two main components here. There's the projectile attack is like the part of the attack that is on the player. And so that houses things that are related to the player. It's think of this as the gun basically. And then there's the projectile, which you could think of as the bullet. And so I'm going to click on this prefab. You can slot in any prefab here, and that changes the projectile that's fired with this attack. So I'm going to click on that and drag this out so we can modify properties on this pellet shot as well. So to make this aimable, the one thing we need to do on the pellet shot here is we can see there's a movement speed on the projectile. It's got an X and a Y movement speed. And you can set these independently. And that gets a little bit hairy when you're making the projectile aimable, because if you're aiming it, then that, of course, changes the X and the Y speed in the direction you're aiming it. So we need to set starting vertical direction. Sorry, it's getting cut off on the side. We want to set starting vertical direction to either up or down, but anything but neutral. If this is set to neutral, then aiming will not work. So I'm going to make sure that's set to up, and I'm just going to apply the pellet shot prefab. And on the Rex attack and the projectile attack, I'm going to make sure Is Aimable is selected. So now we should be able to aim the projectile by pressing up or down or diagonally. It's basically 8-way aiming. And I'll set this in a little bit, but there's actually settings for whether or not the projectiles get destroyed when they hit terrain. So right now they're set to not be destroyed. So we see them like sticking around on the ceiling, which is really funny, but also something that's totally useful in certain situations. Let's try that one more time, and I'll show you guys aiming downward. Oh, and that's not working because we've got a butt stomp attack on the player, which is happening first. Give me 1 second and I'll get rid of that. Okay, so now we should be able to fire downward. And we've got these goofy projectiles just sitting on the floor. That's cool. So the first thing we should do with that out of the way is let's make them not just sit there on the floor. So if we click on the pellet shot again, and most of these options are going to be on the pellet shot itself. So this projectile here has a subheading called Destroy on Terrain Collision. And there's checkboxes for on ceiling, on floor, on left, and on right. And basically what that means is that if any of those boxes are checked, the projectile will be destroyed when it hits terrain from that side. So we can do those all independently. So if you want something where like it's okay for the projectile to hit the floor, but it gets destroyed if it hits a wall, for example, then all of those options are here and you can toggle those independently. So for now, we'll make it so it gets destroyed when it hits the ceiling or the floor. I'll hit the apply button for that prefab. And now if we fire this at the ceiling or the floor, we should see that it destroys itself. So there's a lot of different places we could go from here. So let's see, let's try making it not aimable. And let's see if we can do like a fire flower type projectile, like Mario Bros. Style. So I'm going to set is aimable to false. Oh, actually, sorry. One thing I want to show you guys before that is the limit instances setting. So what that does basically is it means that only X number of this projectile can be visible on the screen at the same time. So if you play something like Mega Man, where it's got that really nice rhythm to the pellet shot, where you've got like the pew pew pew, and you can fire 3 at once. It's always 3 at once. The way they do that is a really similar system to this, where they've got the limit instances would be set to 3 in that case. And so once 3 projectiles are on the screen, one of those needs to be destroyed before you can fire again. So let's test that really quick. So I'm going to sit here and spam the attack button. And we can see it's only going to let 3 of those be on screen at once. So that's the way limit instances works, and it usually makes stuff feel really good. And I believe if we set this to 0, then it just won't limit instances at all. And we can have an unlimited number. And actually, one more thing. I apologize for being scatterbrained with this one. Like, there's so much stuff on the projectile component that I want to show you guys. And I'm honestly kind of just winging this one and just going through and showing you guys cool stuff you can do. So one other cool thing we can do here, on the attack, or is it the attack or the projectile? It's probably on the attack. So cooldown frames is the number of frames between projectile attacks. So let's set that to 5. And there's this option down here called require fresh button press. And that basically means whether or not you have to press the button initially to make the attack come out, or whether holding the button will work. So I'm going to uncheck that. And if you guys think to games like Contra, for example, where you can hold the button down and just get like a steady stream of projectiles shooting out, turning off require fresh button press is going to give us that effect. So I'm just holding the button right now. Alright, so now let's try giving this that Mario Bros. Fire Flower effect. So I'm going to go back onto the pellet shot itself. And we have a subheading on that called Ricochet on Terrain Collision. And like with Destroy on Terrain Collision, we can set that independently for every edge of the room. So I'm going to make this so it ricochets on the ceiling and on the floor. And further down, there's another option called Direction Change. And what that does is it's similar to Ricochet, except it makes it so that the projectile will change directions of its own accord once it's been traveling for a certain number of frames in one direction. So if we set this to, let's say, 20 frames in the up direction, this means that every time the projectile travels for 20 frames upwards, it'll change directions and then start moving down. So then I'm going to set this so the starting vertical direction is down, and I'm going to give this a movement speed of, let's try 5 horizontally and 10 vertically. So I'll apply this prefab, and we should see a projectile that shoots sort of at an angle downward and then ricochets off the ground. Or gets destroyed when we hit the ground. So if you recall, that is destroy on terrain collision. So I'm going to uncheck ceiling and floor, so this will now only be destroyed when it hits the wall. Okay, so that's kind of funny. That came out way too big to be like a Mario fireball, but the principle behind it is correct. Like it ricochets off the floor and then goes up and then comes back down. So let's give that, let's make it so this only goes 10 frames up before it comes back down. Okay, so that's more like it. Let's make it 5 frames up, 6 frames up maybe. And let's get that a little bit more horizontal movement speed. Alright, so now we've got something that actually feels a lot like that fireball from Mario. And the last thing we can try here is we can give this a little bit of acceleration. I'll try giving it 0.25. And this should just smooth it out so the transition isn't quite as jarring when it goes up and down. Okay, so still not perfect, but these are all these settings here you guys can play with. So let's kill the acceleration. And let's try giving this, let's give it ricochet on every side of the room. Then let's give it maybe 10 and 10. And let's have this shoot upwards initially, maybe. Oh, and actually, let me turn off the thing that changes its direction after a certain number of frames. So this should ricochet off of, oh, and you know what, sorry, it's actually probably going to kill itself when it hits the wall. So I'll turn off destroy on terrain collision. So again, I know this is sort of more of like a stream of consciousness video, but it's just such a broad subject, I figured that was the best way to approach this. So this gives us something like I am unapologetically a really big fan of Castlevania 2 for NES. And that's got like the diamond thing that you can shoot, and it sort of does this ricochet thing where it ricochets off of every surface. And the one extra component we could give that is we'd want it to, we don't want it to sit around forever. So we could give it a despawn. And so there's an option here on the projectile somewhere that'll let us despawn it automatically after a certain number of frames. Oh. Of course, it's the very bottom one. It's just getting cut off by the side. Okay, so frames before despawn. So if this is set to 0, it won't do anything, like most of these options. But if we set this to, I don't know, 240, that should give us a pretty good amount of time with this thing on screen, and then it'll automatically despawn itself. So it's just going to bounce around and then despawn itself after 240 frames. So the next thing I want to try setting up is a Castlevania Style Axe. And the axe is one of my favorite sub-weapons in Castlevania, and if you remember how that works, it sort of shoots upward in an arc and then comes back down. So for that one, I want to go to the Rex Physics object on the pellet shot, and make sure that uses gravity is enabled. So that's going to give it that effect where it goes up and then sort of, rather than just like immediately shifting back downwards, it gradually loses velocity and then comes back down at that nice arc. So I'm going to make sure starting vertical direction is set to up. Movement speed, it's just got a little bit of horizontal movement speed, much faster vertical movement speed. I'm not going to do any acceleration for this one. So if we test that, this should shoot upwards and then gravity should bring it back down. And so what's awesome is we actually don't have it being destroyed when it hits terrain right now. And so if we actually wanted to make it, I think the axe in Castlevania goes through terrain. And so we can go onto the Rex physics object and click will ignore terrain. And now this should be almost exactly like Castlevania's axe. If I applied the prefab. There we go. Awesome. So the last thing that I want to walk you guys through, I think, for this video, is let's see if we can make like a Castlevania style boomerang. So I'm going to have no vertical movement speed whatsoever on this one. And I also want to get rid of gravity on the Rex physics object. So I'm going to set the direction change to, let's say like 48 frames on the left or the right. Let's see, no vertical speed. Let's make this go 10 on the horizontal speed. And let's try giving it a little bit of acceleration just to see if that feels right. And I think, oh, so another option that's cool here is these settings right now would make the boomerang like indefinitely keep flipping directions. But the way the boomerang works is basically you shoot it and then it goes back once and then it goes off screen. So if we set horizontal flips allowed to 1, that means that it's only going to flip around one time. And I've got to hit apply. Man, I'm really not nailing that today. There we go. So we've got a little bit of acceleration there, so it kind of gradually comes to a stop and then it comes back at the player. And to cap this video off, I just have this weird impulse to do something really stupid. So I'm going to make it so the boomerang damages the player as well. So with any of these projectiles, of course, on their contact damage scripts, you can set it so it damages the player or enemies or neither or both. So this is going to give us this really goofy boomerang that we can fire, but then we need to dodge it or we risk taking damage ourselves. Yeah, so there you have it. Those are tons of projectile options. Most of those things will work in conjunction with each other. The one thing I would be careful of is the aimable function is aimable. Will not work with every option just because by its nature, changing whether or not you can aim something with the D-pad changes the direction it goes. And so that won't necessarily work with every projectile that's like trying to go in a specific direction otherwise. But most of those other things should play pretty nicely with each other. And I definitely wanted to make sure with this component that you could make most of the major standbys from Mario or Castlevania or Mega Man or like Ninja Gaiden. Or, I mean, I feel like one of the things I'm trying to do with Rex Engine is like you can really tell what old games I fetishize in that way. And I want to make sure there's options to make all of those. So anyway, that's it for now. I'm going to have another video coming up pretty soon that shows how to do charge shots, like in Mega Man, where you hold the button down and then you release it and you get like an extra big buster shot. That is also in here under Tools, Rex Engine, Add Attack, Add Charge Projectile Attack. And so I'll give that its own separate video because I feel like this one's getting kind of long. So in the meantime, I hope you guys enjoyed that video and I'll talk to you guys soon.